Python versus boa, the ultimate battle of giant constrictors. Who would win? This video isn't really about them battling, but if you came here for that, we'll talk about it really quick right after this logo. Welcome to the Green Room. I'm Bob Bledsoe. Okay, as promised, let's get this hypothetical battle out of the way before we get into deciding on your next pet snake. Kent, who do you think would be the loser in a battle between a python and a boa? I'll tell you exactly who would lose. Any human within a 10-mile radius of the two meeting, because they'd probably team up and search out people to feed on. So they'd be safe if they were 11 miles away. They'd probably sniff you out and then feed on your corpse. 12 miles? In rare cases, if they're not too full after eating the other people. But surely they'd be safe if they were 15 miles away. Not necessarily. There could be another python-boa team in the neighboring territory that you just moved into. Well, that gives us a lot to think about. Thanks, Kent. Here's my thought on this. We'll take the largest, most powerful python, the reticulated python, that's the longest snake in the world, and we'll pit him against the largest, most powerful boa. That's the anaconda, the heaviest bodied snake in the world. But we'll say that they're both equal size. They're, let's say, 300 pounds. And so we've got a retic that's a little bit longer and thinner, and anaconda that's a little fatter and shorter. If they're near water, I'm going to give the advantage to the anaconda, because while a reticulated python is very comfortable swimming in the water, the water is literally the anaconda's hunting ground. So I think the anaconda would pull them under and have a slight advantage. If they're fighting on land, here's the thing. Boas are stronger than pythons. So even though a 300-pound reticulated python is going to be incredibly strong, a 300-pound anaconda is going to be measurably stronger. So I'm giving this one to the anaconda as well. Let me know in the comments what you think. Okay, let's get to the point of this video, which is helping you decide on your next snake. We're not talking about retics or anacondas, though. Now, I realize this is Green Room Pythons, but I'll try to be unbiased. In fact, the official mascot for Green Room Pythons is Handsome Dan, and he's a boa. You guys wanted him to be the mascot, so I guess he's our mascot. Hey, buddy, you're the Green Room Pythons mascot. You realize that? It's a lot of weight to carry for a little boa. A lot of times when somebody decides that they want to get a moderately sized constrictor, the choice comes down to a ball python or a boa. Ball python is a specific species within the Pythonidae family, but the word boa could refer to any one of over 50 species in the Boidae family. Usually when somebody says boa without specifying the species, they're talking about either a boa constrictor, which is also known as a red-tail boa, or a boa imperator, which is actually more common to have as a pet. In fact, a lot of people that think they have a red-tail boa, they think they've got a boa constrictor, actually have a boa imperator because the pet store was just calling it a red-tail boa. Confusingly, both species look fairly similar and they both have red tails. The boa constrictor, though, is quite a bit larger and much more expensive. So they're less common to have as pets. So for this video, we're going to focus on the boa imperator because it's actually a closer comparison to a ball python. So if I just start using the word boa in this video without specifying, you can assume that I'm talking about the boa imperator. Quick note, because I'm sure I'm going to get comments about this. If you have a bunch of snakes, if you have a bunch of pythons and a bunch of boas, I recommend that you keep them in separate rooms. Handsome Dan has had all of his panels done. He's been to the vet a couple times to make sure that he's all good. Boas and pythons can pass diseases to one another, and there are some boa diseases that don't affect boas as much, but they're deadly for pythons. So when I first brought him in, I put him in quarantine for a very long time and brought him to the vet a couple times to get panels done. There are tons of differences between boas and pythons, but we're not going to get into everything because that could be a video on its own, and maybe it will be. But just know that boas and pythons live on different ends of the earth than one another. Pythons live in the old world. I'm adding Australia to the old world because we're talking about snakes, and I'm not really including Europe because we're talking about pythons. But ball pythons are right there in that blackened territory. And boa imperator come from the New World, and they are sort of, the ones we're talking about are Central America with a little dip into South America and a little bit up into Mexico as well. So they live on opposite sides of the earth. They don't even reproduce the same way. Boas lay eggs and pythons give live birth. Boas lay eggs and pythons give live birth. Nope. Reverse that. Hi folks, Future Bob here. I'm just sitting in Kent's corner editing the video right now. As a breeder of pythons, I do know that they lay eggs. But if you've watched this channel for any amount of time, you know that past Bob, oftentimes just the words don't come out right. So even though pythons and boas are very different, most of the general public can't even tell them apart. But let's zero in on just the similarities and differences that might affect your decision as a pet keeper. Size might be a deciding factor for you. Ball pythons can average 4 to 5 feet with some outliers on both ends. Boa imperators can average 6 to 10 feet with some outliers. Now, don't be fooled when I have mentioned in past videos that I believe Handsome Dan will be about the same size as a ball python, like an adult ball python. Handsome Dan is Central American, which is a dwarf locality. He's got a high percentage of that in him, so I think he'll be smaller. There are dwarf locality Boa imperators like Hog Island, Crawl Key, but again, we're talking about the most common boa imperator that you're going to find in a pet store. 6 to 10 feet. Here's a good example of an outlier. This is a large size ball python who happens to be in deep shed right now. Damara is 5.5 feet long and she's about 9 pounds. Here's an example of an outlier boa. This is a boa imperator from Snake Discovery. I don't know what size this thing is, but let's take a guess. I'm going to say 100 feet and about 1 billion pounds. That particular snake is one that came in as an adult. It was a rescue, and my guess is that its previous owner just overfed that snake like crazy. Don't overfeed your boas. Don't overfeed any of your snakes, but that's how you get those massive outlier snakes. Both species can eat about the same thing until your boa gets real big, and then you might be feeding it frozen thawed rabbits. Ball pythons have a tendency to sometimes go off food if there's anything wrong, or if you've been feeding them a lot, sort of overfeeding them for a while, they'll just stop eating for a number of months. Boas never do that, and if they do, you should probably take your boa to a vet. That strong feeding response is one of the reasons why you might be more likely to be bit by your boa than your ball python. It's not a huge thing to worry about, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. You can feed your boa a varied diet, and you probably should, and you don't have to worry about them getting stuck on one food item. Whereas with a ball python, sometimes if you try to change it up, they'll go, oh, I just love mice now, and that's all I'm going to eat. It's not super common, but that does happen. Also, this isn't a care guide, but you should feed your boa less often than you feed your ball python. Right now, Handsome Dan gets fed once every 2 weeks. I feed him a prey item that leaves a very small lump in his belly. A ball python of the same size, like Max, who was out earlier, gets fed once every 7 days, and I don't have to worry as much about the size of prey. He can have a small lump or a larger lump, you know, whatever I decide on that week. When Max is an adult, he'll get a small rat every 2 weeks. When Handsome Dan is an adult, he might, depending on his size, let's say he's a little bit bigger, he might get a medium rat once a month. If you have a large boa that's not a dwarf, you might be feeding them a large rat or 2 large rats once a month. You might be feeding them a rabbit once a month. So the prey items are more expensive for your boa, but you're feeding them less often. Hey, don't tell anybody I said this, but your large female pet ball python might do really well on a medium rat every 3 weeks. Keep that under your hat. You know what we haven't seen on this channel for a while? Kent's Corner. Let's do one of those. Hi, welcome to Kent's Corner. This is the corner that I sit in. I'm Kent. Listen, can't you just get a fish? Why are we even talking about man-eating serpents? Is everyone on drugs? I remember when I was in high school, my brother came home with a green snake and it had teeth. And I went into his bedroom and I was like, are you eating drugs? And then he got 2 iguanas and I was like, how many marijuanas are you even on? And I still wonder sometimes, because this is crazy pants. Okay, Kent, I think we get it. Thank you for watching Kent's Corner. You know, since the beginning of people supporting Green Room Pythons on Patreon, I've had a mid-video handwritten Patreon credit scroll. Well, now we're going to a digital Patreon credit scroll mid-video still, because my hands don't work anymore. That might be an exaggeration, but still, we're going digital. Look at this person right here, thanks to them. I don't know who that was, because digital, Future Bob's going to do it. Anyway, I don't know how long this is going to last, the thing, so I don't know how long I have to talk and say things for. But I really appreciate them. They're getting extra videos. They're learning about new species that I get in. They learn usually first before snakes lay eggs. By the way, Patreon, I've got a I got a new little situation to tell you about tell you about it in like 2 weeks, something like that. So how long is this going to go? Are we done? I bet we're done. Thanks, you guys. I really appreciate these supporters. We'll stick with this one handwritten. Thanks to the channel sponsors, Black Box Cages, Lane Labs, and Gray Family Snakes. Boas are more active in general than ball pythons. They're going to move around a little bit more when you're handling them, and they're going to require your focus more than a ball python does. I wouldn't say that they're as active as a retic, but maybe in between the two. You know, in between a ball python and a retic is about the level of activity. They require your focus, they move around. A lot of people like that in a snake, but they're also not going to curl up and sit in your lap while you're scrolling TikTok like a ball python might do. Both species are docile and generally easy to work with, but I would say that you are more likely to get bit by a boa than you are a ball python, both defensively and because of that massive food response that we talked about earlier that they have. Most boas are almost as chill as ball pythons, and I would say the majority of boa keepers have never been bit by their boa. It's just more likely to happen. But as an example, Handsome Dan is, as we said before, a Central American boa. Those Central Americans have the reputation of being super defensive and bitey. He's only struck at me once, and it was when he was brand new. He was in quarantine and not used to me yet. And he's a little bit more like when I come in, I'm real slow and careful with him, because when I come into his enclosure, he's kind of he gets into what seems like a defensive posture, but that also seems like the standard posture for a boa. Hey, what are you doing? Sometimes we have snake appearances from species of snakes that we're not talking about in the video. Echo, you gonna do some hunting up there? She doesn't know it yet, but she's getting fed today. Not the subject of this video. Where are we at on this thing? One thing that might be important to think about is your physical ability to handle a medium to large constrictor. If you know ball pythons, imagine how strong a 10-foot ball python would be. Why? The beep all of a sudden. Imagine how strong a 10-foot long ball python would be. You're not going to run into one probably, but a boa, who easily could get 10 feet long, would be stronger than that imaginary ball python. When I was in northern Utah, up at Clint's reptile room, I was handling his medium-sized boa, and she was cutting off the circulation of my arm. She was just sitting on my arm, but squeezing it so tight. There is a circulation issue in my arm right now. I think I'll be fine. I'll probably be okay. If she was around my neck, she would have cut off the blood supply to my brain, and I would have face planted into the lovely breakfast table that Clint and Leisha had set up. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was just hanging on. They're that strong. Now, I'm a large, relatively strong adult man, and I believe that if she were tightening around my neck like that, I'd be able to unwrap her before I took a header into the yogurt dish. But just like snakes, humans are of different sizes and physical abilities, so it's important to be honest with yourself as to whether you're able to handle a large constrictor like that, or if you have somebody else that can always be in the room to help you, just in case something comes up. Most people won't need help with a ball python, but they might. There are people who have a rule in general that they never put the snake around their neck, they never put it over their shoulders like that, and that's a great rule to have if there's any question at all as to whether you could unwrap a snake from around your neck. Why are you stalking me like that? I see your face. I've got a whole other video about retics right up there, or there maybe. You're more likely to get bit by a retic, I'll just say that. It's more likely to happen. Higher chance. By the way, snakes are never trying to choke you out. They don't understand human anatomy. They don't know what that does if they squeeze on your neck. They just like to squeeze things sometimes. It's them hanging on. And it's easy for them to actually cut off the blood supply to your brain. If they're on your neck, you pass out, hit your head on something, they happily slither off. It could be problematic. So just be careful. As you may know, I'm always more interested in the brain power of reptiles. And boas will interact with their handler a little bit more, I think. And a lot of people equate that to IQ, but I don't know if that's a very good judge of intelligence necessarily. I think that might just be a personality thing between the two species. I will say that I have target trained several ball pythons and they pick up on it quickly. I don't use target training anymore for the ball pythons because I don't have any that really need that as a food cue. But I've also target trained Handsome Dan, and I do use it with him because he does need a food cue. He picked up on it very quickly, and he still strikes at the target. He gets very excited because he knows that that little green ball means food, and he'll strike at it before he can engage his thinking brain and touch it with his nose or his tongue, which is what I want him to do. So when he strikes at it, I just let him reset, and he usually figures it out. He always figures it out eventually. So I would say smart brains on both species, with boas maybe being slightly more interactive. Here's a key difference that you definitely might want to think about. Does your snake have the ability to entertain you by climbing a rope? Boas can do it. Ball pythons can't. Boas are a semi-arboreal species, and the ability to climb a rope like Handsome Dan is doing right now is a good sign that your snake is arboreal or semi-arboreal. If Handsome Dan were in the wild, he would spend a lot of time in the trees, and then as he got bigger, he would become more terrestrial like a ball python. It's important to me, though, that he get a lot of climbing time, so he does this rope climb thing, and usually when he's out, he spends a lot of time in his favorite spot, which is 6 feet up on top of a rack that's kind of cluttered. He's never trying to hide, but he's kind of hidden in some of that clutter, just kind of surveying the area. He likes to be up high. When my ball pythons come out, they like to climb up on things sometimes. They would never climb a rope like this, but they do like to climb up on things. But usually they try to be hidden somewhere, whether it's up on something or down low. It's oftentimes under furniture. As for care, the good news is that your heat, humidity parameters are very much like a ball python. Adjust for size, as far as your cage, things like that. Adjust for their feeding schedule. Don't feed a boa like it's a python. Again, this isn't a care guide, but if you want a boa care guide, let me know and I'll make one. Imagine that. A boa care guide on a python channel? Who'd have thought? But either way, you'll want to dial in those parameters and become an expert in the species you choose. Because regardless of what you pick, if you keep a reptile, you're keeping an exotic animal. And I believe that anytime you have an exotic animal, you should do so much research that you feel like you're an expert in that species. Because you want to give that animal a good home for the next, let's say, 30, 40 plus years. Yeah, they live that long, so it's a good thing you're putting all this thought into it. Now, if it seems like you would be okay keeping either one of these species, like none of these have any problems that would disqualify them, it might just come down to looks. So boas, all of my snakes are morphs. So we're going to say, aside from the paint job, because you could choose, there are some beautiful morphs in boas, there's some beautiful morphs in ball pythons, but just as a body shape in general, boas are sharper. They have more pointy faces, they've got sharper lines, they have these thick square bodies. Everything is kind of sharp and pointy on them. Ball pythons are more rounded everywhere. They've got a rounded nose, more rounded face. Their bodies are thick and round instead of thick and square. Tell me in the comments, aside from morph, which one you like the body type look of better. By the way, in case you're wondering about these particular paint jobs, Handsome Dan is a Central American T-positive fire, possibly a xanthic. He's a 1.5 years old. And Max here is a banana inchy orange dream fire het pied. I think that's it. He's got a lot going on. He is 1/2 year old. They both weigh within 3 grams of one another, 426 and 429. So Handsome Dan is obviously a slower growing snake, but when they're both adults, I expect the boa to be slightly larger. So what's it going to be for you? A boa or a ball python? Or are you getting something else? Are you getting like a king snake or something? Or a hognose? Tell me in the comments, what are you getting? Thanks for watching. See you next week.